I'm going to cover a little bit more about trauma-informed teaching and learning how you can create heroes in your school. You are a hero just for being here. So we'll also learn about healing and learning, also sharing using first-person accounts, integrating art and looking at artwork as a primary source, using history and contemporary issues for teaching and learning, and also fabric arts as kind of a common thread and to make cultural connections and to kind of spark storytelling in your classroom. And I'm going to give you lots of examples. So we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Again, your students, all your students may have experienced trauma at some point in their life. This kind of childhood trauma can be, everything from divorce to a parent's loss of job. Our immigrant students definitely have more of these experiences and maybe don't want to talk about it and definitely do not want to be singled out about it. So you need to be very aware and kind of have a sixth sense in knowing your students. I think a good way to kind of understand your students is at the beginning of the year, just really set your classroom structure, make sure you have routines, make sure that you're doing one-on-one with your students and that you have basic understanding for the goals of learning. I mean, that can be anything from a rubric, and like I mentioned before, use a lot of visual cues. Also, near peer, make sure that your students aren't being sent out constantly to the, the resource teachers. Make sure that you have opportunities in the classroom for everyone to have an opportunity to learn together, and that you're creating agency in all your students, native born and immigrant, because a lot of native born students now also have a tie to immigrant trauma. Like I said before, they may have family members still in the home country, or they may have parents who, are still invested in, caring for relatives and so on and so forth. So let me just pull up my, also understanding the push and pull factors, I think is very, very important. Knowing that at some point your students may have not had access to basic needs, not had shelter, not had food. I mean, this is terrifying for someone of any age, especially young children. As I mentioned before, that vulnerability during the immigration, the journey, and then post-immigration, homesickness is real. It is something that can really affect and stress out a young child, and that stress is proven to have, impact on their learning. So just really create a space where students feel comfortable and that you're also creating empathy in all of your students. And a good way to do that is through testimonials. And I hope that everyone had the opportunity to watch the interview with Esther. And if you had that opportunity, just show me in your panel in the comments. Great, wonderful. So Esther Krenitz, I mean, she's one of my heroes. And this primary account, not only did she leave a legacy of her artwork, but I think her story of resilience and the fact that at age 12, she watched her whole life kind of fall apart with the German occupation coming into her community and ripping up the lives of those that she loved. And at the age of 15, 3 years after going through many traumas of watching, you know, everything from her grandfather's beard being cut off to her brother, you know, having to go in hiding, and then also witnessing a death camp being built near her home. She had to make the decision to leave her family for survival. As they were being taken away on the trains to a death camp, she made a last-minute decision to escape and took her younger sister. So we're talking about a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old who run to go find safety. They go to relatives. Before this even, their neighbors wanted nothing to do with them because they were Jewish. So they go to a relative and he takes them in for a day and then decides it's just too dangerous. So they're in the woods without food, without shelter. And so this is the basic needs for survival. I mean, forget about having dreams or, you know, thinking about your future. This was day-to-day survival. So here you have the victims, you have the perpetrators, you have bystanders, I mean, the neighbors and the friend of the family who just push them away. And you have to have someone who is willing to go above and beyond. And you have who you are. You are upstanders, you are heroes, you are the people who are trying to make change and make your students' lives you know, just more comfortable for them to learn in your environment. So that work that Esther did through her artwork, let's see here, really shows how these small traumas and big traumas can affect the life of somebody. So what I want to do is in the comment box, in the sidebar, I want you to think about strategies that you would use if you had 17-year-old Esther coming into your classroom. So you know she's a great artist, you know that she's very thoughtful, she's brave, but she may just not be able to learn immediately in the classroom. What are you going to do to make her feel more comfortable? Journals, great. Artwork, yes, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Remember, some of your newcomer students may not have the language ability. So journaling for some students can be a great outlet. For others may not be, right? I think using the art, visuals, great. Dance, I love that. Yes, check on her often. I think that's really important. And like I said before, you know, just having those one-on-one conversations, letting your students know that you're there. I love that. Space for emotions, right? Great. These are all really good songs. Wonderful. Okay, great. So, right. So one thing she did do, if you did watch the video, is she would tell her children her story, and it wasn't until 50 years after that she started to sew the panels, and she made 36 to tell her story. And actually those will be on exhibit here in Baltimore in 2019. And I'm going to be sharing some lesson plans with you that are stemmed from that, but also are stemmed from using life narratives, using images and visual literacy, using artifacts, articles and footage, and then also literature. I love that you're putting ideas of books, and I'm going to share some of those books with you as well today. So one tool that we don't see a lot of in the curriculum is just visual literacy. And it's a great way to engage students collaboratively. You can look at points in history without being too heavy. And you ask students, you know, what do you observe? What do you see? What does this remind you of? What is the similarity? You know, what is the significance? When you're looking at photographs, you know, teaching them that this is a real moment in time. And then also when you're looking at art, you have the opportunity to think about the interpretation of the artist, metaphors. One thing about Esther's artwork is that she uses a lot of dreams and metaphors, and they're really, you know, can be dark and light in one image, and then having students really think about, you know, how that makes them feel, or what they see or what they notice. One other thing about the artwork is that you can look at periods of time just based on the foliage or the colors of the sky. Let's see. Also, using visual literacy allows students to start to think aloud and work collaboratively. So this is really good for language development. And you have a deeper understanding. It's kind of a safe way to jump into a topic that may be controversial or painful, and you can really try to evaluate your students through their how they receive, you know, seeing different points in visual literacy. One thing is we will be having a lot of lesson plans coming up in November through Art and Remembrance, and this is the organization that is dedicated to the legacy and story of Esther Krinitz and her artwork. And what they want to do is recognize personal courage, resilience. They want to foster understanding and compassion for those who experience injustice. So I am working on cross-curricular lessons, interactive lessons, and kind of using World War II as a jumping point to talk about current events, about immigration, about empathy, and about resilience. And I think that a lot of students can kind of use the artwork of Esther and her story to learn a lot more about what's going on right now. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek of one of the lessons, and this is one about children escaping war and conflict. And the overview really is just about the basic requirements, as I mentioned. I mean, not having water or food or clothing, having to separate from your family. When these things become scarce and an unaccompanied minor becomes very vulnerable, it really is something, I mean, we can't even start to fathom what these children are going through. So what I've done is comparing the Lost Boys of Sudan using Brothers in Hope. It's a LMNO publication which talks about a young 8-year-old boy whose family is extinguished, and the boys of these communities are forced into to be child soldiers. And this is his story of escape. My 9-year-old daughter read it along with me, and she, you know, asked some serious questions like, why was he drinking his own urine? And, you know, we talked about, you know, what happens in different parts of the world. And now when she sees something in the news, she's able to kind of make connections about migration, about, you know, what young people are having to go through around the world. And although this is a contemporary issue, there are issues going on right now where, you know, young children have to go through similar events as did Garang and also Esther in these stories. So what I did was I created a kind of compare and contrast where students are collaboratively reading or being read aloud and doing picture walks and talking about, you know, the different basic needs of survival. And when you're going through something like this, like I said before, you don't have the option to think about what you want to do when you grow up or where you're going to live. And you're just thinking like minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. How are you going to survive? And really picking through these books, you're looking at who are the upstanders, who are the heroes, because there's always going to be those people who say, wow, this is horrible, but they're not doing anything. So it's important for students to kind of find that agency within themselves in the classroom and build empathy. And so you can use stories, and it's important to use, you know, primary sources and testimonials and first-person accounts. There's a lot of really great, yes, they will be available in November, and I'll tell you exactly how to kind of sign up, so you'll stay in touch and we'll get those, and we might be doing some sneak peeks as well. But what I was saying is, you know, making sure that you're not just using fiction. You want to use a lot of nonfiction. You want to use first-person accounts. There is video testimonials. And then also, when your students feel comfortable, making sure that if they're sharing their stories, that you're putting those out into your community. And again, if your students feel comfortable, you don't ever want to single them out. And if you only have one or two immigrant or refugee students in your classroom, and you're doing these types of lessons, you want to kind of check in with them and make sure that they're okay. You also want to work with the greater team, whether it's your counselors and your ELL teachers and others, to know that you're going to be talking about this. So another way to use World War II is kind of a jumping point to talk about not just resilience, but about you know, the heroes that helped or the events that took place. You can use Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel. I created these lessons to kind of meet teachers where they're at. And if these are required readings in your classroom, you can also use the comparative analysis. And you can also look at other literature. And let's see. So what we're going to do now is they're going to launch a Padlet. And what I want you to think about is, what are some of the historic events and some of the more contemporary events that we can use to teach resilience and immigration. And I'll be checking in here. As I said before, so all humans have basic physiological needs, and during some events, these needs might become scarce. So what I want you to think about, sorry, it's jumping around on my computer, are what are some of the events in history that forced children to separate from their families and migrate for survival? Or what are some of the contemporary events that force children? So events in the past, and events that maybe happened in the last, 15 years. Yeah. So Syria, and these are things that your students or you may be hearing in the news or seeing in the headlines. There's also some great resources. POV has resources. There's a great new book out called Refugee that you can combine with real life testimonials. Yes, and I'm actually going to bring up slavery. I think I was actually hoping someone was going to bring that up. Right, so earthquakes, we talked a little bit about temporary protective status. The boat people, absolutely. Yes, divorce, it's separation. These are all really wonderful. So in the historic arena, we talked a little bit about slavery and about, or someone brought up slavery and also World War II. Anything else historically? That's great, the Native American experience. Yes. Yeah, and a lot of this is not kind of forefront in textbooks, so it takes some digging around. And what we're going to do in our lessons that I'm creating with Art and Remembrance is to have a space where you'll be able to navigate some of these different issues of the past. France and Canada, King's Daughters. These are all really great. Okay, so let's jump back to the, oh, Cuba, yes, absolutely. Right, and someone did bring up the hurricanes, and also, it might not be just foreign-born, but, schools in Houston for a long time had a lot of newcomers, and all of these activities can really help to make all newcomers, whether they're foreign-born or native-born, feel welcome in the classroom. So one thing, kind of jumping back for one sec, is that using timelines also, we're going to be doing that in the lesson plans that we're launching, kind of juxtaposing events over timelines can be really, really impactful. So showing the events that Esther went through on top of a timeline of World War II. You can use any story or real life testimonial and kind of overlap that to see different patterns is really impactful. So here's some suggestions for bringing contemporary events into the classroom with common reads. Although refugee is not first person, it does bring a lot of the contemporary issues and juxtaposes it to a refugee of World War II. And then kind of running through, kind of connecting and teaching, learning, and healing with fabric arts. So showing students story cloths from different culture can be a safe way to show how you can use story cloths as a personal narrative or as a learning tool to think about times of the past. So you have the Hmong story cloths, which came to be in the 70s using native arts of the Hmong culture. They brought them as they started to settle in the United States, and with a lack of the English language, as they started to kind of integrate, they were able to heal through telling their stories through fabric arts. Also, the arpilleras of South America, in Peru, in Chile, against the dictatorships. It was a safe way for people to tell their stories and to kind of be therapeutic in the loss and the traumas that many of these artists had to go through. Also, teaching about the quilts of the Underground Railroad is a great way to show how these stories of resilience and survival, using the secret codes of the quilts that were hung as indicators during the Underground Railroad, is a way to engage young students and older students in showing kind of these stories using fabric arts. These are the arpilleras, the Underground Railroad quilts. And there's a lot of great literature, both for, K through 6, and then also great literature that tells these stories for the older set. This is actually a quilt, you can see it hanging behind, that was a collaborative classroom project. And having students, I know that not everyone has the luxury of time or resources, but there's other ways to do this, even if you're not going to sew, a way to engage your students in telling their personal narratives or their kind of collective narrative using the integration of artwork. So these are examples of art and remembrance projects, and these are actually through the HERO project. These were sewn by young students who told the story of someone in their life who was a hero, who this was a grandmother on the left and a father on the right. It's a great way to combine writing and artwork in the classroom. This is also through Art and Remembrance. It's a project out of, let's see, this one is out of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it's a collective group of women who are recent immigrants, and so they tell their stories and kind of heal themselves through this process of fabric arts and storytelling. And as you can see here, it says, it was difficult to say goodbye to my family and my home to go to the US because I wanted to find my great maybe. And then this is also a project of Art and Remembrance. And this is actually a group out of Northern California, which is tied to their Head Start program. And this is a group of parents who, you know, were refugees and were asked to kind of participate in this. And it was a healing, there was a lot of different players in it, counselors and local groups. But I'm gonna just read, this quilt is my favorite because it is me. Each one of my hair strands represents one of the things that are important in my life. Music brings happiness to my life. My home is love. My teachers helped me achieve my dream of getting my high school diploma and my GED. My traditions play a very important part in my life because I grew up with them and I share them with the world. Every night I ended up like this face, tired and sleeping on top of my workbook. I have a family of 4 sons, and although it was hard work, they were my strongest motivation. My husband was and continues to be the great support for every project in my life. I did it. I finally obtained my GED and my high school diploma. Apply yourself and you will succeed. So this is an example of, you know, using the stories of resilience. These things I'm showing you all sparked from the story of Esther. All of these participants watched Esther's story, they read her book, they looked at her artwork, and then they participated in creating their own story cloths. And so as educators, as administrators, you want to make sure that you're not just kind of staying in the confines of your classroom, that you're using cooperative learning. I'm going to show you some examples of service learning, civic engagement, and project-based learning. All of these create agency in your students, whether they're native-born, foreign-born, refugees, children of immigrants, you know, whatever their past stories are. This gives them the opportunity where everyone has a part in learning, and learning together is the best way. And you can start them young. You can start, you know, maybe a lot of schools have never tried this and it's kind of a process, but trying to do at least one of these in your school, you know, it can take time, and you kind of have to start from the administrators and parents. But I think even just starting as a teacher training, these can be really helpful. So what, you know, there's a lot, as I said before, you know, time and resources, but there's going to be modifications for all of these examples. In terms of service learning, students can create educational programming. They can organize speakers. They can put together a food pantry for newcomers. They can, a lot of times refugees or immigrants will come to a new climate and they don't own a coat. So having students think about putting together donations of warm clothing, having students participate in book and film clubs where they're looking at stories of different cultures and different stories of migration. Group learning. So if your school is not built in a way, the climate in terms of collaborative learning, maybe there's clubs or a way that you can get engaged that way. And then also one thing that I've seen very successful is intergenerational learning. So bringing in elders to tell stories, to read books together, and then even maybe putting together a story cloth. So project-based learning, here's an example of some things I've done with my students using puppetry. It's a safe way with limited language that students can tell their stories. I know this isn't the fabric arts, but it kind of relates to that art integration. And it doesn't have to be this elaborate, but it's a really great way to tell, world culture stories, to tell immigration stories, to talk about, the things that they love and what their passions are. And you can do this from child to adult. And then here is using graphic novels to create biographies. Again, you could do a collaborative book. You can do one square, you can do entire books. Let's see where we are on time here. And then also using other resources. These are made out of tissue boxes, and looking at heroes and change makers, using literature to learn about people who immigrated or those who helped immigrants. And here's another, you don't have to do the fabric arts. Collage is also a great tool. These were actually personal narratives that students created using shadow boxes and collage. And I have here my contact information, but I want to look at some of your comments. Okay, so when stories of trauma are shared, yes, so you want to, like I said, make sure that the school community understands what you're going to be doing. So if you have a student who is exhibiting, behavior based on trauma, make sure that they don't feel singled out, and that you kind of start slow. And I think using history can be really helpful. I think Esther's story, even though it can talk about traumatic events, that students really do resonate with the artwork. And then because it was a real person, it's not, like a lot of times teachers will be given the tools to teach the Holocaust with images of bodies, and that can be really, really traumatic. So talking about life that was kind of normal and then changed because of a Nazi occupation, and then this journey, although there are traumas in it, it's a way that students can understand that things have happened in the past, horrible things have happened to other people, and through resilience and through people who really cared about them, and through them like rebuilding and finding their passions, that they were able to, to survive and to become who they wanted to be. So any questions?
Yes, so if anyone has questions, please type them now. We have a few more minutes with Claire. We did have one about the intended outcomes of these kinds of projects. And we're walking a very thin line, but the intended outcomes of these kinds of projects.
Okay.
Do you have, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, sharing stories is very important. When a story comes from your community, that has even more impact. So when students do feel comfortable telling their stories, whether it's through artwork or through writing, sharing that in the school community, I think can build empathy. So that's one of the outcomes. I think also the process can be very therapeutic. And, sometimes students may not be comfortable sharing, and that's totally fine. If they're participating and creating something for themselves, if they don't want to share it, that can also be part of the outcome. I think it's just making sure that everyone has a part of that process, and that you're also making ties to current issues, I think is the key. So using events of the past as a jumping board to, understanding what's going on today is critical.
And one question that I'm sure you've been asked before, how do you incorporate this into maybe like different subject areas, for instance, like science?
Yeah. So, one of the lessons that we're developing right now includes the timelines, which ties into math and science, measurement as part of the curriculum. Then maybe, tasting foods can be part of the curricula. It's, kind of a, what do you call it, like an enrichment activity. Also, just, these are cross-curricular, and then hopefully they're also collaborative.
And when teachers have a situation where it's, it's not an entire ESL classroom, it's just a handful of immigrants, maybe just 2 or 3. So how do you go about doing these kinds of exercises in that kind of situation?
Right. I think I had mentioned this before. So if you have just a couple immigrant students, you want to, first of all, make sure that you're not singling them out. If you're doing these, this is about, everyone's stories. Everyone has a hero. Everyone has felt new in some type of situation, like as a newcomer in some situation. So tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But really what you want to do is make sure that your students are all informed, and make sure no one feels singled out, and that these don't have to be about, the traumas or your journey, but just about who you are and what your strengths are. And, hopefully as you're doing this, you're supporting all of your students and building empathy.
All right, and one final question. There are teachers, I'm sure, who would just love to publish success stories and wonderful things about their immigrant students, but a lot of the logistics are a little bit tough. Getting sort of the media permission slips from their students. Are there easier ways of going about sort of publishing more broadly outside of the agency success stories and other stories about their immigrant students?
So I think most of what Art and Remembrance has done and what I've done is that you're really kind of showcasing in your own community, meaning in your school, or maybe inviting the different organizations. And yes, like having permissions can be difficult, and there are opportunities for that. But just, start small and don't worry about, about that. Just build that safe space in your classroom, and then, anything is possible.